You can raise your prices, lose a lot of customers, and still make more money. I'm going to show you exactly how and even show you why it's very important that you do this right now. Okay, so let's say you own an HVAC company. It doesn't matter if it's a plumbing company, electric company, or if you're a painter. If you're in the home service industry, this is going to be the most important pricing lesson that you've possibly ever learned. All right. So a lot of times we're scared to raise our prices for a couple reasons. Number one, we say that we want to be fair, right? And I get it. I want to be fair also. I've owned my company for over 21 years and I love my customers. Here's the thing. What if your pricing is fair to your customers, but you're struggling to pay your bills? You're struggling to pay your technicians. You're having a hard time staying in business. Is that a fair price? Isn't a fair price fair to both sides? So we don't want to make up a number of what we think is fair, right? The price should be able to take care of your customers and pay your bills and make it worth it for you to be in business. The second reason we're normally scared to raise our prices is because we fear that we'll lose customers. Here's an issue with that. Number one, your biggest competition in your town that's taking your customers is likely more expensive than you. It's the bigger companies. Number two, even if you lose customers, if your pricing is right, you'll make more money with less customers. Let me show you why this is true. If you take a look at this chart here, you'll notice something very interesting. So this states, if you look at the bottom, that's the percentage of a price increase. Let's say you raise your prices today, right now, by 20%. You just raise it. Your expenses don't increase, your overhead doesn't increase, you raise your prices. If you look at the left-hand side, this is going to show you what percentage of customers that you can stand to lose and still make the same amount of money. If you look at the bottom, if you raise your prices today, instantly, by 20%, you can lose 16% of bids and still make the same amount of money. So if your closing rate is 30%, and you go down to 15% closing rate, which is horrible, by the way, you would still make the same amount of money. If your closing rate was 50%, you win half of the jobs that you quote, and you raise your price today, you could drop down to 33% closing rate and still make the same amount of money. And guess what? You'll have less jobs to do. Isn't that amazing? That's why the math is so important. So don't be afraid to raise your prices, especially because many of us are underpriced anyway, and the only reason we're not raising prices is because we're afraid of losing customers or we're afraid of charging a fair price. But you have to charge a price that's fair to both sides, you the business and your customer, and you can't be afraid to lose customers because, as I've just shown you, you can raise your price, lose customers, and still make the same amount of money. Another interesting thing is when you raise your prices without raising your overhead, your profit changes, it increases disproportionately. So for example, if you decided today that you're going to raise your prices by 20%, you just change the price, you didn't add any expenses, that 20% price increase, it doesn't amount to a 20% net profit increase. It's actually exponentially more than that. That's the beauty of math. Let me show you. All right, let's say that you operate right now at a 30% net profit margin and you raise your prices by 20%. If you see this chart here, if you look on the left where it says 30% margin, if you raise your prices 20%, you just change the price, you don't add any expenses, your profit margin goes up to 66%. Raise your price by 20%, increase your net profit by 66%. Because you've raised the amount you're bringing in without raising your expenses. That's the beauty of a price increase. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to set your prices correctly to make sure that you're not underpriced, because most of the time contractors are underpriced anyway. So you're not raising your prices just for the sake of doing it. What we'll be doing is we'll be raising your prices to where they're supposed to be in the first place. Okay, let's get straight to how to price your services, all right? Now, it's very important to remember that we have to price your services using math, not using what we think a price should be, what our competitors' prices are. None of that matters. The only thing that matters is, does your price cover your cost? Does it cover your labor? And does it put money in the bank to continue to operate your company? And even if you have enough profit, You can do everything that your heart desired when you started your company. For example, you can sponsor a local baseball team. You can sponsor a local initiative. You can sponsor Kids at Risk. Profit allows you to do everything that you originally wanted to do when you started your company. Lack of profits stops you from sponsoring local initiatives, stops you from funding your dreams, stops you from paying your labor, and stops you from paying your bills. So we don't want to price according to emotion. We're going to price according to math. I'm going to show you exactly how to price your services. Let's do it. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to put some overhead in our calculation, all right? This is a document that I like to use. This is a great way to get started on pricing your services. You can do this yourself with a pen and paper. You can do it yourself with a calculator, or you can use this document. It's available. I'll put a link to it in the comments. I also talk about pricing in my book, The Profit Playbook. You can see it over my shoulder here. I'll put a link to that if you want to dive even deeper into pricing or running your company. All right, let's take a look. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add up some of our overhead. In this example, I have an owner's salary here. These are just to give you some examples of some overhead items. So I have office personnel, I have fuel, I have truck payments, insurance, you name it. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to add these up and get an annual number. Now, if you have multiple trucks on the road, what I do on my pricing document is I put the salary of the lead technician and a separate line for a helper in a truck. If you're watching this and you're a one-man show, then this wouldn't matter, all right? But if you do have employees, then you're going to have to price their labor in, okay? All right, so what you'll do is you'll add up all of your overhead, and that's going to give you a number. For this example, the overhead is $259,000, all right? Now, what I like to do is take all of that cost, the overhead cost, and the labor cost for that technician in that truck to cover that overhead and to get a profit margin, all right? Remember, if you're one person in a truck, you're paying all the overhead and you're paying your own salary. And of course, you want to make a profit because you don't want to break even. If you have technicians, your technicians are dividing the overhead. They're taking a slice of that pie and they're paying their own salary and they're adding profit to the company. This is why I like to use a document like this, because it'll get all mixed up and confusing if I don't, okay? You may be a math whiz, you may be able to just do it on a piece of paper, okay? So in this example, the overhead is $259,000. Now, I like to put a margin on my overhead, right? I like to use a divisor because I want to make a 50% profit margin, okay? So for this example, we need to make, after we pay our overhead, with margin, $518,000. Okay, this is just an example. Don't get caught up over small words or one little thing that I said. This is an exercise to get your pricing to where it needs to be. All right, if you want to do a super deep dive, go onto my link, schedule a meeting with me, and I will love to walk you through it. Okay, right, let's take a look here. Now, this is super important. I'm going to skip some of this stuff, but there are some things that are very important. Mainly, how many hours are available to bill to customers? And this is where most people get their pricing wrong. There are 40 hours a week where you work 8 to 5, and you work Monday through Friday. That's a 40-hour work week. You take that times 4 weeks across 12 months, that'll give you around 2,000 hours available. Here's the problem with that. There are not 2,000 hours available to bill customers because you have what's called windshield time. You're driving to the supply house, you are loading up your truck with inventory, you're going to training classes, you're probably off on Christmas and Thanksgiving, you're off on a good amount of holidays. So if you set your pricing and you divide it amongst all 2,000 hours available, you're going to come up short because you're not working that much, you're not billing that much. Typical companies are about 50% efficient. So what I encourage you to do is set your prices at 50% efficiency. If you want to set it at 60% or 70% because all businesses are different, you're free to do that. But for this pricing example, I encourage you to set it at 1,000 and start right there. Okay. Now, if you have one person in a truck, you are going to be paying all the overhead and paying your salary because you're the only one. If you have multiple trucks, like I said earlier, you can have those technicians take a slice of the overhead and pay for that. And of course, they're paying their own salary and the overhead and the cost of goods with that particular job. We're not going to get into that right now. Okay. So in this example, this company has 3 trucks. What this is going to do is set the price that you need to charge every single hour. Now, if you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, in this example, $238 an hour, you may be saying, that's a lot. Here's the beauty of doing your pricing using math. These are the numbers that you put on. These are the numbers you calculated. Your company is different than my company is different than your company. But when you use the actual numbers, as they say, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie, the price could seem high and you could decide not to charge those prices. But guess what? You may feel good about your prices, but your bills won't be paid. Your company won't grow. You won't be able to sponsor all of those organizations that you've been dreaming of sponsoring. Okay? So we have to separate our emotions from the prices. This is a simple way to find out what your pricing is. And I'll sum it up. You add up all of the overhead in your company, including your owner's salary, including all of those things that you have to pay for, softwares, everything, Christmas party, whatever it is you do in your company, you add that up. The jobs have to pay for all that. So you're going to divide that by how many hours are available. And like I said, there's not 2,000 hours available because you're losing a lot of time at the supply house, calling customers on the phone, doing estimates. You can't bill for that time. So you have to bill for a shorter amount of hours, which inflates your prices. And that happens to any company, whether you're large or small, you have a small amount of hours available. So if you want to use this pricing document, it'll help your pricing. It'll break it down very simply. It'll make it very quick. It's available in the description. If you're inside the coaching program, you get it for free. It's part of the program. Also, if you want to do a deep dive into running a business, the Profit Playbook, I will link to that also. All right, have a good day.